My name is Sergey Chernyshev. I've been doing web technology for quite a while, and around, 2007, I started to get interested in web performance, and in the very early days of this. And among other things, I built a tool called ShowSlow. Maybe you heard of that. It was a tool to capture synthetic metrics that came out of YSlow, page speed, Dynatrace, Ajax, and WebPageTest, those kind of tools, so you can see the trends over time, right? And obviously I organize New York Web Performance Meetup and talk about performance quite a lot. So that's me, right? So why do we measure speed? I think it's important to understand, and I just gave a workshop about performance, and a few people hoped that I will just give them the magic tricks, right? Like, hey, pour some of this or some of that. And I believe I did, except that that's not necessarily what they expected. So my main message was, first thing you need to know is that you need to measure, right? And without measuring, you actually don't know how fast things are or how slow things are, for that matter. And we have multiple needs as a team. By the way, who is in operations here? One, two, a few people, three, yeah, some people. Developers, more developers, okay. Anyone on design, on the user experience side? I know you are. Not design, but user experience, okay. Okay, more on front end. Any business managers and kind of product owners? Anyone? Okay. Okay, a few. Okay. So one of the obvious things, the first people to measure were people in the operations world, and for obvious reasons. We want to make sure that sites don't go down or don't slow down. We want to make sure that what we put out there actually operates well, right? And in terms of performance, it's critical because usually we only get reports when stuff is broken, right? But very rarely people call us and say, hey, it's very slow, but I can still use it, right? Usually they just don't use it, right, instead of making a call. So it's important to monitor for performance and to understand how fast your users experience the thing, right? On the development side, we have a couple other somewhat different things, right? Today, DevOps is a thing, right? And we kind of all in the same kettle, and we all making the things work. But in reality, developers are building the code that operations teams operate. And you need to mingle together and to understand each other's side. But one important thing that developers do is they analyze the code for performance problems, right? They go very deep and they understand what slowed down the user's experience, either temporarily because of the report or why is it slow generally, right? And you need to know that deep technical understanding to have very detailed understanding of what exactly in this particular use case slowed us down. And there are a variety of things that can be the culprit, and Meet for Speed sessions that we talk about is one of them. But there is another part to that, which we kind of forget, right? We always in the operations world, we're like, oh, something is wrong. Let's address it, right? But in reality, you also need to make sure that what you changed actually improved the performance, right? One is like always, this happens always. A developer comes to me and they're like, let me optimize this thing. And I say, okay, go ahead. And they go and optimize it, and that had no effect whatsoever. Or sometimes they use a technique that actually slowed things down, right? Or basically, unless you understand what actually slows you down, and you measure the stack thoroughly, you will not be able to know what to optimize. And to verify your improvements on the development side, you also need to measure. You also need to establish performance budgets and make sure that you don't go over and things like that. Unfortunately, all of that takes money, right? Your time is not free, right? You could build features instead of optimizing performance, right? And for that reason, we want to make sure that we only optimize things that are most important. And the business needs some method of telling us, hey, this is more important than this. How would you know if you don't measure it? I mean, in terms of features, yeah, you can say, like, the person went and read the book about better attracting users, and they say, yeah, let's have that feature. You trust their expertise. But in terms of performance, if you don't measure, how do you know what's more important? Obviously, what makes it faster is more important, right? So you do need to measure to accomplish that. And generally speaking, after your backlog is so long that it will be longer than what all of those features, right? You actually need to get money and say, hey, instead of building that feature altogether, I will rather spend that time in optimizing our existing features because, you know, it's probably more productive. For that reasons, I mentioned WPO stats in my introductory slide. There is a lot to say about why would you need money, right? And all these companies, thanks a lot to all the people who actually put effort into documenting all of that. All of these companies publicized the effects of performance. And WPO Stats is run by Tammy Everts, who I mentioned. She is a researcher at SOSTA, and Tim Kadlec, who is actually now, I think, researcher and evangelist at Kpi. Maybe you heard some of these numbers that Google actually found that half a second delay loses them a quarter of their customers, right? Imagine $6 billion company at the moment, you know, losing $1.5 billion just because of half a second delay. Kind of big, right? And there were quite a few other researchers over time, and these are great examples. Like, for example, Google and Microsoft did this research in 2009 that not only slowness reduced the engagement and reduced the amount of customers, but after experiment was over, people actually didn't come back to the same level of engagement for, I believe, 6 months or something, right? So it's not only about immediate effect, it's actually a long-term brand effect that you can have if your website is slow. And one of the last posts in that WPO Stats blog, and by the way, they only accept business, like stories that have business effect, right? That clearly states, oh, we didn't just improve speed or whatever, right? And we were 11 seconds instead of 10, or the other way around, whatever. You know, they actually accept only business metrics. And that metric that the Trainline team had, that they reduced latency by 1/3 of a second, 300 milliseconds. And they earned $11.5 million more that year because of that improvement. That's amazing. The site actually has links on where you can listen to the talk, and it's amazing how much better user experience can affect your baseline, right? So if you need inspiration on how far you can get your business with performance, right? If you want to convince your business team to give you that money to do performance, please go and measure. And please read all of those articles and try to figure it out. So let's talk quickly about how can we measure. And there are two primary methods of measuring performance of your website. One that I mentioned in regards to SOSTA is real user measurement, right? And there are other vendors that provide similar service, and you can technically, potentially build yours if you're really into it. Essentially what they do, they inject the JavaScript code into your page, right? All of your pages, and real users, when they go to your site, they send back measurements from navigation timing API that browsers support, W3C navigation timing, and some other custom measurements that they try to capture. It's a lot of data, as you can imagine. It's real users. Every user will send some beacon back. So that's why buying a service from a vendor is a great idea, because It's a lot of data, basically. You need to build another data center just to accommodate the same kind of traffic, right? And you need to store all of that data. But more importantly, you actually need to know how to filter that data out, because it's very noisy. You need to understand what's the differences between different browsers, and well, I'm not even talking about bugs in all of those browsers and how to capture it properly, right? What's critical to understand about this class of tools is that all of your metrics that you're going to measure are never in one number, right? It's not like, how fast should our site be? Oh, let's do 2 seconds. No, 2 is too aggressive. Let's do 4. Right? This is not how it works. All of your users have different conditions under which they experience your website. Slower networks, poor browsers, well, different browsers, poor hardware, right? All of that results in a distribution, and this is the log normal distribution that most of the these kind of measurements have, right? And it's important to understand that you always have different users with different experience, right? Maybe you don't have 0, right? But you have a lot of users somewhere in whatever the second, however many seconds that top represents, and a lot of long tail users, right? And it's important to realize that in the real world, that's what we have. And not to confuse one number that you get out of other tools with this, right? Obviously, I mean, maybe it's not that obvious, but just trust me that if you move more users from the right of this chart towards the left, the more money you will make, right? And good RAM company will let you correlate that to your business KPI. In e-commerce, it's literally dollars. In media, it might be ad impressions, engagement, whatever business metrics run your world. You will be able to correlate performance to that, and that's the best way to actually predict how much performance improvements can get you, right? So that's your real user measurement. The other set of tools, kind of usually in contrast with real user measurement, is called synthetic testing, and these tools usually give you more analytical data, because just by definition, oh yes, sorry, before I talk about definition, it's a tool that actually runs the computer in your data center or in some data center, and it's instrumented with different tools to measure timing, capture waterfall charts, capture video of the screen changes, right? And it's obviously not a real user sitting in front of it. But it's many great synthetic tools today run real browsers on real devices. It can be mobile devices, for that matter, on mobile networks and stuff like that. But it's one execution at a time, right? So you execute it, you measure all of that, you capture all of that data, and you can do it multiple times, right? And you can do it from multiple locations, but it's not all your users, right? It's not real users. That's key. One significant difference is that they are not on real networks. Good tools try to emulate the networks properly, right? But there's a not real Wi-Fi with 20% packet loss, for example, right? Or Wi-Fi next to the microwave oven with 80% packet loss, right? Or whatever the situation in all of those long tail users on RAM could be, right? Good news is that, as I mentioned, it lets you analyze the performance well, because it gathers a lot of data that you wouldn't be able to gather from real users. For example, you can't really record video of the screen from real user. It's more data than you actually user gets. It will defeat the purpose of using networks, right? User's experience will definitely be degraded if you do that for every user. But there are other things that you can collect in a much better way than real user measurement would, like deep waterfall analytics, or a few other, like CPU utilization on the machine and things like that, right? Or actually network. WebPageTest is the tool that we use at Meet for Speed sessions, is this kind of tool, this synthetic tool that we look at a lot, right? Again, one metric value, right? You measure once, maybe 5 times, but not 100,000 times, right? So you don't have a distribution necessarily. So always keep that in mind. but you control it, and you can really gather a lot. And that's why we will, not why, but we're going to concentrate on that method today. So let's talk quickly about the metrics themselves and kind of an evolution of the web performance metrics throughout the years, how they changed. Originally, we all looked, obviously, at very obvious things like DNS, domain resolution, and SSL headshake, although it became a much bigger thing now than in the past. And time to first byte is our kind of, many of you might know it as the time it takes for server to output its content, right? Literally, it measures like from a request up to the first byte coming back. So basically, everything that happens outside of our control, right? On the server, in the network, on the way to it, all of that, right? Kind of your back-end time, right? We call it databases, whatever it is, right? So that's those are the metrics that are critical. We all probably been there, and we all optimized our SQL queries, caches, disk drives, whatever our systems depend on. When we talk about load testing and capacity planning, we want to make sure that with more users, this metric doesn't degrade. Well, all metrics don't degrade, but this is the one that we are particularly interested in because that's usually the metric that degrades, right? Unfortunately, users are people sitting in front of their computers and don't give a shit about that server over there that you have in your data center, right? And for that very reason, we try to understand what's going on in the browser in front of the user. And, well, by now, it's also a very standard thing. We also already analyze on-page load event, document complete, how long it took for every asset to load, like fully loaded metric, right? We try to understand how things load into the browser, right? And it helped us a lot understanding, for example, that not everything downloads in a zero moment, right, when the user clicked. By the way, that's how I started the meetup, when most of the people were very surprised to know about it, right? Well, frankly, Chrome developers, well, Chrome didn't exist, and Firebug was a kind of a, NetPanel was a new thing for many people, right? But people didn't realize that that's what's going on. And by the way, IE6 had only 2 connections per host name. IE6 is gone. Yay. Although it became much harder to do the web performance analysis because it was so pathetic, it was so easy. Sorry, I digressed a little bit. So this second set of metrics was very browser-centric and kind of very close to the user, but it was measuring the browser, measuring what browser thinks is going on, and didn't really represent what user experienced, right? There was some, like, in fact, I believe document complete is when your spinner, your progress indicator in the browser stops spinning or whatever. There are different browsers do different things, right? But generally speaking, that stopped being the thing. It's not like the main thing. People don't really wait until your spinner stops spinning. They actually look at the content, although some people do, by the way. But more importantly, the code, our dynamic loading and our widgets and our asynchronous loading became such that those metrics stopped really representing user experience that closely, right? And for that reason, we started looking for better metrics. And that's how first paint metric was born. Essentially, if you can capture screenshots from your screen as page loads, you can see when first thing changes, right? First thing being painted. Until then, you're kind of screwed, right? Nothing happens. Nothing happens on the screen. User clicked and nothing shows up, right? So it's a great metric to put, to make as short as small as possible, because until something happens, your user is looking either at your, blank screen is only in the test, but in the previous page, right? And usually that's a search engine where your competitor is right next to you, right? So those 3 seconds it takes, like, person's looking, oh, okay, this site is not loading, and clicks exactly on your competitor, right? So it's a very good metric in that sense. About the fold time, it's a little harder to capture when everything visible on the screen stops rendering, right? And that metric kind of wasn't as popular because, again, for many people, not everything matters, and again, it's harder to capture, but it's a good metric, right? Page loaded. For the user, it did load. Until they scroll down and see things that didn't load, they don't know it didn't load, right? So it's a very good metric to pay attention to, and to try to measure. That represents user experience much better. And there is a speed index. How many of you heard of speed index? Please raise your hand. Couple people, yeah. So this is a metric that I'll show in a second that kind of helps you understand something in between those two nothing to everything kind of situation, right? Okay, so again, time to first paint. Very useful metric, except not really, because you cannot see anything, right? So it's not really, it's kind of a negative metric, right? But it gives you a perspective of how bad things are, and that number needs to be like as close to 0 as possible, right? In this particular test that I ran, it was 3.5 seconds, and if you run yours, you might be surprised of what you see in reality, right? Above the fold is the opposite, right? This is CNN homepage at that particular moment in time. Pages change over time. Above the fold stopped rendering additional pixels at 15.3 seconds, right? Also very important metric, although 15.3 is kind of high, right? We are not happy about it, but at least we know that everything that user was supposed to see, they saw at that moment, right? So it's very kind of interesting one. Not many people measure it because it requires video capture and kind of analysis of when the hell does it stop changing, right? And if you look at this film strip for that test, you can see that in the beginning it was like all empty shots, and in reality it will be like probably previous page, not really blank screen, but not your website. Then something rendered, and that's where the green line, the first paint is. And then it kept rendering, and the blue is where above the fold finished rendering, right? So whole experience actually happened between those two moments, from nothing to everything, as I mentioned before. And this is a visual completeness chart that kind of WebPageTest creates using visual analytics tools that Patrick wrote. Patrick Meenan is the creator of WebPageTest. He wrote the tool that basically analyzes how final are the pixels, right? And how many of them are final. And obviously it goes from 0, the previous page, all the way to 100, like the final above the fold. But how fast it progresses there is important, right? Because it can go render everything and the last pixel is not done. Or it can go and be blank, and or like one black pixel in the corner, or a scroll bar is popular, right? Scroll bar is rendered and nothing until everything renders, right? So this shape of this chart is important, and that's what speed index metric represents. You can read documentation about it. It's kind of not very complicated, but essentially it's the area above this chart, right? So how incomplete is the whole experience, basically, right? And unfortunately, it is measured in seconds, but this number means nothing, right? It's just big number, and all you need to know about it is that you need to reduce it, right? So amount of incompleteness need to be reduced, right? It's a great metric. It's a very automatable metric, right? If you capture video, and it's a good metric to follow because you can just trend it down. But unfortunately, it's hard to explain to business. 8,618 is not something you can really say because it doesn't mean much. And the moment you try to calculate the area, most of the business people in the room like blank out and just have no clue what you're talking about. That's why we all teamed up and tried to create something better that represents what we want to do, right? What is important to our business. And W3C created a standard for user timing API, meaning that it's not the browser that knows and calculates things, but your website can actually indicate when something important happened on your page. So for example, when your JavaScript loaded and you rendered some, let's say, carousel, you can send the user timing beacon and say, hey, event X, you can call it carousel rendered event, happened, right? And you can capture that both through real user measurement, because it runs on every page, or through synthetic, because your synthetic tool can actually capture that as well, right? And you can track that in your release timeline, right? You can do automated tests like that, and perf budget plugin for Grunt, for example, that uses WebPageTest to calculate. That is a good example. Tim Kadlik, who I mentioned before, wrote that, and it's a very useful tool to make sure where code is committed, it doesn't go above that, right? And again, you could measure every metric like that, but the metric that matters to you is the most important one, right? Unfortunately, it requires us to instrument every page, right? And to detect when did the thing we care about happen using JavaScript. And that is not always possible. Because JavaScript is kind of an engine that tells the browser what to do. But it's not necessarily the engine that does the rendering or does the interaction on the page, right? It only reacts to it, if you know what I mean. For that reason, it's sometimes quite hard to understand when the image rendered on the page, for example, using JavaScript. Steve Souders, the guru of web performance, recently, maybe this year, maybe last year, I forgot, wrote a blog post trying to capture the hero image metric, like exactly this use case, right? A carousel or a hero image, when does it render? And he was able to kind of create a kind of a set of rules under which if you calculate these 5 metrics and kind of make sure one is above another and things like that, you would be able to understand when hero image finally rendered, right? But it was, well, it took Steve Souders to do that to start with, but also it wasn't as precise either, right? And unfortunately, the more complex the rendering interaction you want to measure, the harder it is to do, right? Everything is hard to instrument. For example, in single-page applications, I don't know, you're familiar with routers, right? Like the router library that will go and change the page without changing URL, or changing the URL but without navigation for you. But the point is that it kind of emulates the page navigation, but kind of view-to-view navigation. Most of the time, that's kind of important for you to understand how long that took. Unfortunately, in most frameworks, you can only tap into when you asked it to navigate, or where all the JavaScript code executed in order to navigate. But it doesn't tell you when image is loaded or styles got applied, when user actually saw the transition, right? I don't want to kind of say that it's a bad method, by no means. It's actually the best method that we have today in order to instrument something, probably the most accurate one that we can use today. But there are some inherent problems with it, as I just mentioned. And again, if you give developer JavaScript, they can measure everything, they can build everything with JavaScript. Probably our life will soon become JavaScript engine. So it will only improve, right? And with enough effort, you can probably instrument a lot, right? But unfortunately, it's not really user experience, although it's probably the closest thing today. And that's what I kind of want to remind you of. And many people in this field, in the measurement field, in technology, in operations, and in development world, we get into this trap where we measure what we can measure, right? And by the way, that picture is from a Russian joke, and I'm sorry if translation didn't work that well, but the idea is that the drunk is looking for their keys in the park, and the police officer comes around and asks them, what are you doing? And he says, oh, I'm looking for the keys. And police officer joins and helps him, tries to find it. And in 15 minutes, he says, like, what the hell? We cannot find it. Where did you lose them? He says, oh, over there. So why the hell are you looking here? Oh, there is a light here, right? So that's kind of the problem that we all have. We try to measure what's easy to measure, that has low noise or has very easy instrumentation. And by all means, the first thing you can measure, please do. But don't forget that what we need to measure is actual user experience. And until we have that brain implant in every user, that metallic thing on the back of your skull that sends the data back to the mothership, that is not going to happen. And hopefully, as a user, it will never happen, right? We also matrix, right? But what it means is that every metric that we use is a proxy for user experience, right? More importantly, speed is also a proxy for user experience. If they hit the guts of the services and it's fast, it's still bad service, right? although we can make it faster and make them suffer less. Right? What's more important, make sure you correlate it to business KPIs. And business people, unlike us technologists, are kind of always very good at that. They'll say, oh, how much money does it make? Or do people actually come back? Or how many ads did they click or watched, right? So you always need to make sure that what you measure represents user experience, and if you can correlate it to business, it will help you build a business case and kind of guide you through your optimization experience. So again, don't measure what is easy to measure, measure what actually matters. And I believe the whole history of metric evaluation and whole history of analytics is kind of defined by that problem, right? Measure what actually matters. And today, I want to kind of introduce this new method of defining what matters using heat maps and therefore measuring the performance metrics and defining those performance metrics through heat maps. Unfortunately, it's not your traditional heat maps that you probably got used to, or at least not only those heat maps. And you can see probably at the top picture is the one that the most mostly resonates with you if you hear the word heat maps, right? This particular one is the eye tracking picture from Bing research, right? It shows you where did people look, right, on your page. And the bottom one is click tracking that Google Analytics can give you, for example. Both of those are heat maps. It tells you like which parts of the page matter more to your users, right? Or at least which parts of the page people interact with more, right? In bottom case, it's clicking, and so interacting. In the first case, it's consuming information, meaning looking at it, right? But that's first class of heat maps that I want to cover is user action heat maps. Things that we can capture from actual users using our site today, right? And unfortunately, they're a little hard to capture, right? All of those techniques, especially in automated fashion, are kind of hard. Again, even if you don't append the brain implant, capturing user site is kind of problematic without them agreeing to that to start with. Click mapping is a bit easier, but it's still a lot of data, a lot of analysis that needs to go to make sure you filter out the wrong things and attribute clicks accordingly, right? But there is another problem with this that is kind of not very obvious. It shows you what is happening today, right? So first thing, if you're developing a new site, no one clicks or looks at it yet, right? So that's kind of a usual real user measurement problem. Until you have real users on it, you cannot measure it, right? But there's another problem to it is that, well, people actually look at things that are faster, right? If things showed up, they look at it first. So we have this chicken and egg problem that we can measure what is already fast, and if we define that as the most important thing, then we'll keep improving that instead of improving what actually matters to users, right? So there is this kind of cause and effect problem, right, that is somewhat hard to overcome, right? Although good scientists will be able to figure out how to do that. Unfortunately, I don't have any data like that, so I didn't run any research on this, but general idea that I'm going to talk about can applies to these heat maps as well. So it actually doesn't matter how you generate heat maps. What matters is how you define what matters. No pun intended there. So there is another side of heat maps, right? You can say, hey, what are we trying to achieve with our website, right? And that's not usually what you think of when you say the word heat maps, but we can kind of say that, hey, on the homepage of CNN, that photo is probably the most important thing. Otherwise, it wouldn't take most of the space there, right? But on homepage of Amazon, that's different, right? Obviously, the heroes kind of is a replication of that, right? Like hero image is kind of manifestation of most important part, but it only applies to the most important part, right? It doesn't apply to like how do users know where they are on the site. On different websites, it will be different, and on different pages of Amazon or CNN, those components will be different, right? So looking at at least with a business eye, is actually going to help you a lot. If you talk to a business person, they actually know already. And by business, I mean content editors, designers, product people, UX people of your team. They will actually know what's most important on this page. In fact, they designed this page to showcase what's the most important on this page to start with, right? So the great news that we have as technologists, which is rarely the case, is that business actually knows the answer right away. So the goal is to try to capture that answer from them, right? But unlike user interaction heat maps, these heat maps we can capture from our business team, right? And we can identify those areas that are important. The question is which areas? Which particular areas, and what are we looking for here? And I tried to create this kind of a framework for generalizing the experience that people have with the page. And hopefully all of this happens in this order, right? First, when a user interacts with the page, we want to acknowledge that user interaction was accepted. The most common example is forms, right? When the user clicked on the button, submit button, we don't want them to submit twice. Usually because we don't want server to receive data twice, but generally speaking, we tell people, hey, we're loading your data, thank you, don't click here again, thank you very much. You know, again, thank you, while they're waiting for the next page, right? But at least, if nothing would happen, users are just frustrated and keep clicking, right? So that's first thing, but that's kind of on the previous page, so it's equally first as it is seventh, right? So it's kind of like, it's between pages, right? You finish the first experience, you're ready to interact. That interaction should kind of help you acknowledge that interaction happened. The second one is verifying the destination. And the different business pages, the different businesses and the different pages on the site, it can mean slightly different things, but generally speaking, if user wanted to land somewhere, we need to show them that they landed there, right? And that's the most important thing because they will click back button very quickly otherwise, right? And usually it means that we want to show a logo of the site, right? If they came from Google and clicked on a CNN link or a story link and they maybe saw CNN but they clicked, and if it's not CNN that's loading, they don't want to go there. Or if it takes a while, they might go away without us showing that it's CNN. But in some cases, it can be a breadcrumb, right? Like a page that you wanted to go deep into the website, and you want to make sure that you landed on a particular product page, right? So to your website, it might vary a little bit, or maybe from template to template, it will vary a little bit. But generally speaking, we want to make sure that the user is landing where they were supposed to land. And if they do, if they feel that they are in the right place, they will wait a little longer, right, for the rest of the content to trickle in. And that's where primary content shows up. And you will be surprised how many times I would ask a person, okay, what's most important on this page? And they'll say, okay, let it load, oh, there it is, right? I'm like, why is the rest of it loaded? And the most important thing, especially those carousels, my favorite topic, if you've never been to Meet for Speed's meet, you know, carousels usually load last because of technical implementations, although lately it's been a little bit better. But if it's the most important content, we want it to load first, right? Why? Because we want people to start consuming the content, because before they can interact it, buy your product, or click on the ad, they actually need to look at whatever you're trying to show them. And they cannot really, and people are not that fast. They cannot like immediately make a decision in a split second and start clicking like hell. For newspaper article, for CNN homepage article, well, it takes a while to read the article, right? Or even to understand the title if I want to click on that big homepage thing, right? And the next thing is allowing for that click, for that interaction to happen, right? To let person act on your content. And the whole website experience is receiving content, understanding what you got, acting on it. Receiving next content or whatever piece of interaction and acting on it, right? It's human-computer interaction, right? So that's kind of a next step, very important step. If your buy button doesn't work, it's kind of bad, right, if you have a product. And then secondary content to allow people to make alternative decisions. Maybe if they don't want to buy a product, maybe they can buy somebody else's product, right? Or if you have secondary articles, kind of less important ones, maybe they want them to click, or maybe they read this one already, right? And the last step is kind of the most exciting one. Well, nothing happens. The user has no clue what happens. All the analytics beacons fire, all your below the fold things load. Whatever happens, the users don't give shit at all. So that full load event actually doesn't matter that much, because it doesn't matter when Omniture Tracker actually tracked that I interact with the page, right? And again, next action, acknowledge it, next page, all these 6. So I try to have this abstraction for all interactions, but for your own business, you might have more detailed steps in each of these, and you definitely will be much more specific about what they are. And this is CNN homepage that we just saw, and I tried to kind of identify a couple of them, a couple of components. So imagine you talk to a business owner and you say, hey, what's your core branding and navigation that's important to your user to show them that they landed in the right place, right? And they will say, hey, that logo and that nav at the top probably shows you where you are, right? So they will circle it on the paper or whatever they will do to identify that. And when you say, hey, editor, what is the most important here? They're like, what, you stupid or something? This is the most important thing here, right? The point is that they will actually know the answer to these questions, right? And I'm spending so much time on saying that because, again, measuring what we can measure doesn't matter. What we need to measure is what's important to the user, right? And again, that's why I had this slide. So every time you look at every metric, remember, it's a proxy. Remember that you need to understand how it affects user experience. So I'll keep repeating that 1,500 times. Sorry. So once you had this conversation, once you went to your business, and maybe not 2, but like all 5 or 6 steps of these, whatever you will define, you ask them which design components represent that business need that we had, right? Primary content, secondary content, what is the most important interactive call to action, right? CTAs, they're usually called. What is the most important CTAs? How do people navigate? What is secondary? Very important, because everything is top priority for the business, because they want you to do everything. So it's very hard for them to prioritize. So primary is primary, but secondary, identify the secondary content. Maybe even order that if you have a lot of secondary content, like this page probably has, right? Home pages usually are like that, right? So once you do that, it's very simple. You create these cutouts, and these are the heat map cutouts. That's why the word heat maps come here, right? We identified what's important, what is higher priority than the rest. And we put that on these two, for these two particular events in the page, on these two cutouts, right? All of those elements in the nav and that primary content. And this is our definition, right? It's very hard to automatically do that again. Remember, like automated tools would be happy to accomplish that, but it's very hard to do, right? But if you talk to the business, the answer is right there. It's actually very simple to get that information. And then you go ahead and you apply that cutout over each frame in that film strip, remember? Like from nothing to everything, you apply it to every frame, and you go and draw that visual completeness chart, but now only with the cutout applied, right? The rest is equally blue-white all the time, or transparent, whatever you make that, right? The point is the rest of the pixels don't change, right? And the moment you do that, something interesting happens. Remember, first paint was, well, actually it's showing right there, 3.5 seconds. And above the fold, well, all the pixels painted was 15.3 seconds, right? But now, here, all of the navigation and core branding rendered, finished rendering at 8 seconds. It's that simple. If you make this simple video manipulation, the very same method of measuring above the fold can tell you when your event that you tried to measure happened. And now we have not only like from nothing to everything gap, right? Like a huge kind of encompasses your experience, but doesn't tell you what's important. And now we immediately say, hey, navigation was ready at 8 seconds. And you can be a little more granular if you want to understand when logo was ready versus nav was ready or this and that. But the moment you define that cutout, you can do that. And same goes with your primary content, right? You apply the video, frames to the video, you measure visual completeness, and hey, look, at 11 seconds, our primary content was ready to be consumed. And again, as you can tell, some of it actually rendered a little bit earlier, so you can talk to your business to say, hey, how important it is for us to have 100% pixels ready, or like maybe our threshold for this measurement will be 75%, like a little bit less aggressive. Or maybe we want to narrow down, right? Like maybe it's not the picture that's important, but the link or the vice versa, right? The picture is what's important as a content, not as a call to action, but as a content. Or maybe you, as a call to action, you measure the link that it renders the way we want it, right? But essentially what it means that we now got the primary content metric. The very same method, we just isolated the visual changes on the page to what matters to us for this particular event in our sequence, right? And what it brought us is not just two metrics at the beginning and at the end of the visual change, right? But two additional metrics that don't have the abbreviation TTFP. If you go to a business and say, hey, our TTFP is 3.5 seconds, right? Time to first paint. Oh, awesome. First paint. What do you mean? You actually paint it or something? No. But if you tell them, hey, our core branding and main navigation showed up at 8 seconds, they're like, oh, really? That's a while, right? And they say, oh, primary content took 11 seconds to actually show up. That is much better. And obviously, the more metrics like this you have, the more conversation you will cover. It will be like, when can they interact with it, right? Is another important one. I just wanted to showcase a couple here. So suddenly, with one definition, one time we define those cutouts or heat maps, we can now track this metric over time, right? We can go ahead and track those two numbers as our primary metric. And it's analogous to those user timing APIs that we talked about that use JavaScript to mark the beacon events, right? But in this case, they are gathered through an eye of a user. Okay, not real user, unfortunately. It's, again, synthetic versus RAM conversation, but it's another way of gathering this metric. And unfortunately, it might be relatively hard to accomplish this in real user measurement scenario right now because video capture is hard, right? But maybe there can be some other solution in the future that we can come up with and measure real users this way as well. In any case, it helps you identify the issues, and if you manipulate your synthetic environment to match some of the use cases that you have, it will help you understand on this range, where are your metrics, right? And these current implementations that I did, it's a first prototype, and I hope that we'll integrate it into a visual metrics script that Patrick Meenan wrote and that is used in WebPageTest. Actually, Antoine Arlaud started, my co-organizer who runs Meet for Speed, started doing that customization. So this one is, again, using user definitions, right? Coming back to, you can actually do what end users do, right? You can measure eye tracking, click tracking. This measures business needs, right? There are two types of heat maps, again. So this one only does the one where you define the areas. But the very same tools that analyze above the fold in WebPageTest today will be able to, soon will be able to analyze custom metrics like our specific ones. And I can show you a few videos that were created for this particular test. So this is the test that I ran on WebPageTest for that page, right? And you can see the film strip view. You can recognize it from the slides, right? And the waterfall, and you can analyze deeper, right? But what I did, in fact, I used this so-called custom metric that WebPageTest supports, where at the end of the test, you can actually say, hey, execute this JavaScript, and whatever it returns, please record it as this metric, right? So if you go to WebPageTest, let me show you, let's say, here, and you go to Custom Metrics tab, and you paste this script that I will make available that will start like this, right? This is the name of the metric, right, over here. And this is the function that goes and calculates things. And it's actually very simple. It calculates the overall screen size, and then it goes through the areas that I defined using CSS selectors and says, hey, where did that area end up at the end of the test, right? And it just collects all that data and returns that value as an array of those zones, like remember those cutouts, basically, right? And here is the definition for CNN homepage, right? So basically, I actually measured three things: the basic nav, which is the logo, and I used like these are the navs that we want to track. Sorry, this is the primary content that we want to track, and these are the nav selectors that we want to track. So I went and pasted that into the script over here. And when I ran my test, if we go, I think over here, yeah, this is a little stretch because it returned the whole JSON structure over here instead of like regular, it's just a number metric that you try to return, right? But it kind of returns that structure that says, hey, for viewport width, blah, 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 for basic zone, it's this area, pixel, blah, 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 and so on. Obviously, manually, you will never apply that, but if with those scripts that we try to implement, you will go and out of all film strip images, you will go ahead and generate a few videos. So, for example, open. So this is the original video that WebPageTest actually generates on its own. Sorry. So this is the one that you would get from WebPageTest of page rendering. Remember, 3.5 seconds first paint, and then things started to come in, and eventually they end up as they're supposed to be. Logo shows up and all of that. So this is the source video that I analyzed, right? And then for each of those points, let's say the navigation, right? Nav MP4. So if we apply that overlay, heat map overlay, cutout, I would say, then this is the video that the same metrics tool will go and do analysis on, right? Quite useful, right? Although for nav it's kind of tiny, hard to see, although on this screen it's better. But primary content is a little more informative in that sense. Here we go. Again, nothing happens for a while. And then, hey, look, something shows up and something is not right. Oh, now it's right. Remember, the visual completeness was at 75% kind of somewhat complete, right? But you can argue with your business whatever this is enough, or if this point in time is good too, right? And why the hell do we even have that happening on the page to start with, right? Why didn't we code it right so it shows up early, right? Well, I worked for Turner before, so it's not really polite for me to say that, but anyway. So those are the tools, and we hope to, by the way, if anyone wants to join into this Python coding exercise, I wrote a prototype in Shell and PHP originally, but we're going to write it, update the Patrick's code, and maybe eventually build a part of UI of WebPageTest to let you capture those. So if anyone wants to join, please let me know. But that's kind of about it. That's the method of defining better metrics. So, thank you. Any questions? Yes, it's a very good question. So the question was, a lot of people, when they switch to building single-page applications or they go in that route, a lot of monitoring, how you do monitoring changes, and they want to understand how do you monitor Backbone, React, Angular, or whatever you have. How do you, in that more complex interaction on the single page that doesn't have any navigation from page to page, how do you measure? What's important there? And I believe those are the two methods that we have today. JavaScript instrumentation, user timing API, right? Since, well, you already have JavaScript developers who wrote it to start with, right? They actually know inner workings of your application. So that's where operations people who probably run monitoring today need to invite the developer people who actually wrote the app. to join the conversation, and they will be able to help you build the JavaScript instrumentation. And you're with a performance vendor, AppDynamics, right? So it is a tough thing for you because, like in the past, you just plug in the tool, and I worked for Keynote in the past, so I know that conversation very well, you know. But in reality, that is the challenge. In fact, this work came out of that very question that I was asked: how can we start measuring single-page applications, right? But that being said, the visual, the heat map method can work as well, because in reality, what you do is to really navigate the synthetic tool through user interaction. You actually need to instrument it anyway, right? You need to actually say, hey, this tool, please go to that page, enter username and password, wait for page to load, then click this button and measure how long it will take until whatever next form shows up, something like that, right? A lot of Keynote scripts that we wrote were doing that, right? So if you can capture video during this very same experience, and if you can define those main 6 steps in page load as a business user who creates that experience, you will be able to capture similar metrics. Again, visual capture is important. Let me put it this way. User brain implant is needed, but we cannot get there, right? So visual capture is probably the closest we have today to accomplish that. That's why I looked at this method. So Kevin experiencing pop-up overload, right? You see a lot of pop-ups. You're talking about window pop-ups, overlays? Overlays, yeah. So basically, experiences that are interrupted, right? Well, pop-ups are kind of harder to measure just technically, right? But at the same time, if you capture the screen, it's the same method, right? And overlays come to the very same scenario as single-page applications. Again, single-page application is kind of an ultimate opposite of multi-page application, but the reality is somewhere in between. There's always interactive experience on the page that might take longer, and it might be a whole experience of your users or maybe sub-experience. And overlays go into the very same category where, you know, some experience happens the moment you interact with the page, right? Remember that, those 6 steps, right? When action happens, the user starts to experience something, let's say overlay. When it finishes presenting itself and, let's say, click button or whatever you want them to do, enter the email maybe, right? The moment you can enter email is when your primary interaction, like number 4 in this list, happens, right? So I believe this is universal enough with maybe a little bit of fudging depending on your business. This method is relatively universal. So the question is, how do we capture more complicated journeys on your website? How do we present all of that information? What's the best way, right? And generally speaking, I found visual presentation working the best. Well, I keep repeating that, but the film strips in particular, right? They help showcase how pages load pretty well. And well, film strips are static, or videos as an animated version of that, right? WebPageTest captures every 100 milliseconds, so it's very close to video experience that you will get. And if you have a multi-step experience, you can run separate tests that test just each step individually. Or if you find, let me know which tools they are, tools that let you in one swoop capture video of each interaction of the step, interaction of the journey, I should have said, then define them as videos, because we as technologists, we might know the numbers, and that visual progression chart is very good for us, right? Like it's that metric, that speed index number that means nothing to business, but we can relate to because it's an area above the chart, right? Unfortunately, they are very hard to deliver to business. These are this chart literally shows that there's a line at 8 seconds mark. So the question about, so the second part of your question is, how do you show how the site performs during the day, and maybe that particular metric during the day, right? And that is the challenge, right? Because video capture on real users is a problem, right? When we say during the day, you probably don't mean during the day. You probably mean for our real users in the real world, right? And that is the challenge today. And with JavaScript instrumentation, you can capture that using ROM, and then it is not a challenge. If you can instrument it using JavaScript, then for every user you will know, and you will have your distribution. Again, remember, not one number, but distribution, right? And if that distribution changes because of load, let's say, or because of some other factors, right, you can capture that over time, right? And the real user measurement tool is the one for you. And maybe that's how you do it. Maybe you go and use this for visual analysis, and that's actually how I plan to implement it at my current employer. We'll go and use this method of analysis to identify those metrics, those key metrics, and using synthetic analysis, very visual, to work with our business to identify them. But then the most important ones, the ones we think correlate the most with the business value, we will go and instrument using JavaScript. More importantly, then, we will also use synthetic analysis to verify if JavaScript implementation was actually correct, if it actually catches this moment in time, right? And maybe you instrument it using visual tools, but then you run using JavaScript implementation and you get ROM data from there. Yeah. Unfortunately, this is very new, so I don't have the answers for you, but this is probably the approach. Yes? Yeah, and I know that SOSTA is doing something similar. Multiple page interactions contribute to one transaction, and one great thing that you can do with real user measurement tools, remember, track the KPIs. So if you can, let's say if you're a commerce site, right, you can go and record how much money did that person spend, and then you can capture that, and SOSTA, for example, allows that kind of instrumentation. Our team uses that. It helps you then correlate not performance, not those variations, whatever, but money, right? You actually can track money and the effect on money. So